The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic and straightened his bearskin hat. At 28 years old, he had served as a Queen's Guard for 6 years, standing motionless for hours while tourists snapped photos and tried to make him laugh. Today felt different somehow, though he couldn't put his finger on why. James had grown up in a small village in Yorkshire, the son of a coal miner who had dreams bigger than the underground tunnels where he spent his days. When James announced at 17 that he wanted to join the military, his father had been skeptical. The boy was smart enough for university, maybe even medical school. But James had his heart set on serving his country, and eventually his parents came to understand his calling. The selection process for the Queen's Guard had been grueling. Out of hundreds of applicants, only a handful were chosen each year. The physical requirements were demanding, but the mental fortitude needed was even more challenging. Standing perfectly still for 2 hours at a time while maintaining complete awareness of surroundings required a special kind of discipline. James remembered his first day on duty, how his legs had cramped and his back had ached. The tourists had seemed like a blur of faces and camera flashes. Now, years later, he could identify potential threats from the corner of his eye while appearing completely oblivious to the world around him. The other guards respected James. He had a reputation for being sharp, observant, and unflappable. His fellow soldiers often joked that nothing could rattle him, not even the time a pigeon had landed on his hat and refused to move for 20 minutes while a crowd of tourists gathered to watch and laugh. On this particular Tuesday morning, the usual crowd of tourists had begun to gather, school groups from various countries mixed with families on vacation and history, enthusiasts eager to witness the changing of the guard ceremony. James took his position at the palace gates, his rifle held at the precise angle drilled into him through countless hours of training. Among the crowd, 3 men stood out to James, though he gave no outward sign of his awareness. They were dressed casually in jeans and hoodies, but something about their body language set off alarm bells in his trained mind. While most tourists moved with the relaxed, curious energy of people on holiday, these 3 carried themselves differently. Their eyes moved constantly, scanning not the palace architecture that fascinated other visitors, but the security measures and guard positions. The first man was tall and thin, with nervous energy that made him fidget with his phone constantly. The second was shorter but broader, with the kind of build that suggested serious time spent in a gym. The third seemed to be their leader, calm and calculating, his gaze lingering a bit too long on the guards' positions and the palace layout. James had been trained to notice such details. Part of being an effective guard meant developing an almost supernatural awareness of human behavior. Most people looked at the guards with curiosity, amusement, or respect. Some tried to get reactions, making faces or telling jokes. Children often waved, hoping for some acknowledgement. But these 3 men looked at the guards the way someone might study a lock they were planning to pick. The morning progressed normally otherwise. The changing of the guard ceremony went off without incident, drawing applause from the gathered crowd. Tourists continued to take photos and ask questions of the police officers stationed nearby. Street performers entertained children while their parents browsed souvenir stands, but James kept tracking the 3 suspicious men throughout his shift. They didn't behave like typical tourists. Instead of taking photos with the guards or exploring the palace grounds, they seemed to be timing routines and mapping escape routes. The tall one kept checking his watch, while the broad-shouldered man positioned himself at different vantage points around the area. During a brief moment when his replacement arrived for the standard rotation, James managed to catch the eye of Constable Williams, one of the Metropolitan Police officers assigned to palace security. A subtle nod in the direction of the 3 men was all it took. Williams, a veteran officer with 15 years of experience, immediately understood the silent communication. The constable began his own discreet observation of the trio. Within minutes, he too recognized the warning signs James had spotted. The men's behavior pattern, their strategic positioning, and their obvious lack of genuine tourist interest all pointed to potential trouble. As the afternoon wore on, the 3 men became bolder. They started moving closer to the guard positions, testing boundaries. The leader approached James directly, standing just inches from his face and making crude comments, clearly trying to provoke a reaction. When James remained motionless and silent, the man's frustration became visible. What the three men didn't realize was that their every move was being recorded by multiple security cameras positioned throughout the palace grounds. Additionally, plainclothes security officers had been discreetly deployed to monitor the situation after Constable Williams reported the suspicious behavior. The tension escalated when the shortest of the three men began making increasingly aggressive gestures toward another guard stationed near the palace entrance. His companions joined him, forming a semicircle that effectively blocked other tourists from approaching. Their voices grew louder, their language more offensive, as they seemed to be working themselves up to something more serious than mere harassment. James maintained his position and composure, but internally he was preparing for action. Years of training had taught him to remain calm under pressure, while simultaneously preparing for various scenarios. His grip on his rifle remained steady, his breathing controlled, but every muscle in his body was ready to respond if the situation escalated to physical confrontation. The other tourists began to notice the commotion and started backing away, creating a wider circle around the increasingly aggressive trio. Parents pulled their children closer, and several people began reaching for their phones, though whether to call for help or record potential drama was unclear. What none of the bystanders knew was that specialized response teams were already being quietly positioned around the palace perimeter. The moment these three men had been identified as potential threats, a carefully orchestrated security protocol had been set in motion. Radio communications crackled with coded updates as various units prepared for multiple contingencies. The stage was set for what would become one of the most dramatic incidents in recent palace security history, though the three would-be troublemakers remained blissfully unaware that they had walked into what was essentially an expertly laid trap. The three men had spent weeks planning what they believed would be a simple prank that would go viral on social media. Marcus Thompson, the leader of the group, had convinced his friends Danny Walsh and Kevin Torres that they could become internet famous by provoking the guards into breaking their stoic demeanor. What started as a dare in their local pub had evolved into an elaborate scheme that they thought was foolproof. Marcus worked as a delivery driver and had always harbored resentment toward authority figures. He saw the Queen's guards as symbols of an outdated system, pompous figures in ridiculous uniforms who thought they were better than ordinary people. His plan was to humiliate them publicly, recording everything for maximum social media impact. Danny, unemployed for the past 8 months, was desperate for any kind of excitement in his life. The prospect of internet fame appealed to him more than the modest jobs he had been half-heartedly pursuing. He had been the one to suggest they take things further than mere verbal harassment, proposing they try to physically move one of the guards to see what would happen. Kevin was the most reluctant of the three, but peer pressure and his own financial struggles had convinced him to go along with the plan. He had a criminal record for petty theft and couldn't afford any serious legal trouble, but Marcus had assured him they wouldn't actually be breaking any laws. After all, they reasoned, tourists interacted with the guards all the time. What the trio didn't understand was the serious nature of royal security protocols. They saw the guards as tourist attractions rather than active military personnel, protecting one of the most important locations in the British government. Their research had consisted mainly of watching YouTube videos of tourists posing with guards, completely missing the subtle but significant security measures that surrounded every public interaction. James Mitchell continued his watch, his trained eyes cataloging every movement the three men made. He noticed how Marcus kept gesturing to his companions, clearly coordinating their actions. Danny had positioned himself near an exit route, while Kevin nervously checked his phone, presumably to ensure their recording equipment was ready. The palace security team, meanwhile, had identified all three men through facial recognition software. Marcus had a history of minor disturbances at public events. Danny had been arrested twice for disorderly conduct, and Kevin's theft convictions made him a person of interest in any suspicious activity. This information was quickly relayed to the response teams preparing to intervene if necessary. Constable Williams had discreetly moved closer to James's position, though he maintained the appearance of routine patrol duties. His radio crackled with updates every few minutes as the situation developed. Behind the scenes, armed response units were being positioned at strategic points around the palace perimeter, their presence invisible to the gathering crowd of tourists. The three men made their move shortly after 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Marcus approached James directly while Danny and Kevin flanked him from either side. The crowd of tourists, sensing drama about to unfold, began gathering in a wider circle, many pulling out phones to record whatever was about to happen. Marcus started with verbal provocations, standing so close to James that his breath fogged the guard's brass buttons. He made crude jokes about the uniform, the hat, and the Queen herself. When James remained perfectly still and silent, Marcus grew more aggressive, waving his hands in front of the guard's face and making loud, offensive comments designed to get a reaction. Danny joined in from the left side, making exaggerated military salutes and shouting mock commands. He thought he was being hilarious, unaware that his behavior was being transmitted in real time to security command centers throughout London. Kevin, meanwhile, hung back slightly, his nervousness growing as he noticed how serious the nearby police officers were becoming. The situation escalated when Marcus decided to test the physical boundaries. He reached out and poked James in the chest, a clear violation of protocol that immediately triggered the next level of security response. The moment Marcus made physical contact with the guard, silent alarms began sounding in security offices throughout the complex. James felt the poke but maintained his position, though his grip on his rifle tightened almost imperceptibly. His training kicked in fully now, his mind running through various response scenarios while his body remained statue still. He was acutely aware that any reaction on his part needed to be measured and appropriate, but he was also prepared to defend himself and the palace if the situation demanded it. Danny, emboldened by his friend's success in touching the guard, decided to up the ante. He grabbed onto James's rifle, trying to pose for a photo while Kevin recorded the incident. This was the critical mistake that transformed their prank from a minor disturbance into a serious security breach. The moment Danny's hands made contact with the weapon, emergency protocols activated automatically. Armed police officers who had been discreetly positioned around the area began moving toward the disturbance. Radio communications exploded with urgent updates as the incident escalated from suspicious behavior to direct interference with a guard's equipment. James finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone trained to handle dangerous situations. He commanded Danny to release the weapon immediately, his words cutting through the crowd noise with military precision. The tourists around them suddenly realized this was no longer entertainment, but a serious security situation. Danny, shocked by the guard's sudden response and the gravity in his voice, hesitated for a moment but didn't immediately comply. His hesitation proved costly, as additional security personnel began converging on their location from multiple directions. What had started as a prank was rapidly becoming a potential criminal incident with serious consequences. Marcus realized their situation was spiraling out of control but was too proud to back down in front of the growing crowd. Instead of diffusing the situation, he doubled down, encouraging Danny to continue while positioning himself to interfere with any approaching officers. Kevin, meanwhile, had gone pale as he finally grasped the seriousness of what they had initiated. The crowd of tourists began backing away more quickly now, sensing real danger rather than harmless entertainment. Parents gathered their children and moved toward exits, while others continued recording, drawn to the drama despite the obvious risks. The atmosphere had shifted from curious excitement to genuine tension as everyone present began to understand they were witnessing something far more serious than they had anticipated. Security. Cameras captured every moment of the escalating confrontation, providing multiple angles that would later be analyzed frame by frame. The incident was being monitored not just by palace security but by anti-terrorism units and senior government officials who were kept informed of any potential threats to royal properties. The stage was now set for a dramatic confrontation that would test every aspect of the palace's sophisticated security systems and demonstrate why the Queen's guards were far more than ceremonial figures in elaborate uniforms. The moment Danny's hands touched James's rifle, the situation crossed a line that palace security had spent decades preparing for. What the three men thought was a harmless prank had just become a potential weapons seizure incident at one of the most protected locations in the world. James Mitchell's years of training took over completely. While maintaining his composed exterior, he shifted his stance slightly, securing his weapon while simultaneously assessing the threat level of all three men. His voice, when he spoke again, carried the weight of absolute authority that could only come from someone prepared to use lethal force if necessary. Danny Walsh felt the change immediately. The playful atmosphere he thought he was creating vanished as the guard's demeanor shifted from ceremonial statue to active soldier. The rifle, which Danny had grabbed thinking it was merely a prop, suddenly felt very real and very dangerous in his hands. He realized with growing horror that he was essentially attempting to disarm an armed military personnel in front of hundreds of witnesses. Marcus Thompson, however, was too caught up in his own bravado to recognize the severity of what his friend had just done. He continued shouting provocations, now directing them at James personally rather than just making general jokes about the guards. His voice grew louder and more aggressive as he sensed the crowd's attention focused entirely on their group. Kevin Torres had stopped recording and was backing away slowly, finally understanding that they had crossed far beyond the realm of harmless pranks. His criminal record meant he couldn't afford to be arrested again, and the weight of potential terrorism charges was beginning to dawn on him. He tried to signal to his friends that they needed to retreat, but Marcus was too deep into his performance to notice. Constable Williams had been moving steadily closer throughout the confrontation, and now he was within arm's reach of the group. His hand rested casually on his radio, but his eyes were locked on Danny's grip on the rifle. He had called for immediate backup the moment the weapon was touched, and he could see plainclothes officers moving through the crowd from multiple directions. The tourists surrounding the incident had mostly backed away to what they hoped was a safe distance, but many continued filming with their phones. The footage they were capturing would later become crucial evidence, showing clearly that the guards had acted with restraint, even when directly threatened. Social media posts were already beginning to appear as people shared real-time updates of the unfolding drama. Inside the Palace Security Command Center, monitors showed feeds from dozens of cameras focused on the incident. Commander Sarah Henderson, head of Palace Security, watched the situation develop while coordinating response teams. She had been in charge of royal protection for 12 years and had seen many potential threats, but weapons interference incidents were among the most serious situations they faced. The security protocols that kicked in were the result of years of planning and countless training exercises. Armed response teams that had been positioned around the palace perimeter began moving to predetermined positions. Snipers who maintained overwatch of the palace grounds adjusted their focus to the developing situation. Every entrance and exit to the palace complex was being monitored and controlled. Danny's grip on the rifle was becoming increasingly uncomfortable as he realized the weapon was heavier than he had expected and that the guard was not going to simply let him pose for photos. James had positioned himself so that Danny couldn't easily move the rifle in any direction that might pose a threat to bystanders, while also maintaining his ability to regain full control of the weapon if necessary. The crowd had grown larger as word of the incident spread through the usual tourist areas around the palace. People who had been visiting other attractions began gathering to see what was happening, though security personnel were now working to establish a wider perimeter and move civilians away from the immediate area. Marcus finally began to sense that something was seriously wrong when he noticed the increased number of police officers appearing around them. What had started as a fun prank was clearly being treated as a major incident by law enforcement. His confidence began to waver as he saw the serious expressions on the faces of the approaching officers. James spoke again, his voice cutting through the noise of the crowd with military precision. He instructed Danny to release the weapon immediately and step back, explaining that failure to comply would result in his arrest for interfering with military personnel and attempting to disarm a guard. The formal language and official tone finally penetrated Danny's awareness of how much trouble they were in. For a moment it seemed like Danny might comply, and the situation could be resolved peacefully. He loosened his grip slightly on the rifle and took a small step backward. The tension in the immediate area decreased fractionally, as it appeared the incident might end without violence. But Marcus, perhaps sensing that his moment of internet fame was slipping away, made a decision that would transform their prank into a genuine crisis. Instead of encouraging his friend to comply with the guard's instructions, he grabbed Danny's arm and shouted for him to hold on to the rifle, claiming they weren't doing anything illegal and that the guards were just trying to intimidate them. This encouragement from Marcus caused Danny to tighten his grip on the weapon again, just as Constable Williams reached the group. The officer immediately placed his hand on Danny's shoulder and identified himself as police, ordering him to release the rifle and step away from the guard. The official police intervention marked the point where the incident became a formal law enforcement matter, rather than just a security concern. Kevin, watching the situation spiral completely out of control, made the decision to distance himself from his friends. He began backing away through the crowd, hoping to avoid being associated with what was clearly becoming a serious criminal incident. His departure left Marcus and Danny facing the consequences of their actions without their third accomplice. The sound of additional sirens could now be heard in the distance, growing louder as emergency response vehicles approached the palace. The Metropolitan Police had deployed their standard response protocol for weapons-related incidents at high-security locations, which meant armed officers, negotiators, and incident command personnel were all en route to the scene. James remained perfectly positioned throughout the escalating chaos, his training allowing him to maintain control of his weapon, while monitoring threats from multiple directions. He could hear radio chatter from the officers around him coordinating their response, and he knew that within minutes the situation would either be resolved peacefully or escalate to a level that would require immediate and decisive action. The three men who had started the day, thinking they would pull off a harmless prank, were about to discover that interfering with royal security was one of the most serious mistakes they could have made. The consequences of their actions were about to unfold in ways they had never imagined possible. The sirens that had been distant background noise suddenly became overwhelming as multiple emergency response vehicles converged on Buckingham Palace. The sound filled the air with an urgency that made everyone in the vicinity understand that something very serious was happening. What had started as three men trying to create viral content had triggered one of the largest security responses in recent palace history. Armed response. Vehicle units screeched to a halt at strategic positions around the palace perimeter, their officers quickly deploying with automatic weapons and riot gear. The Metropolitan Police's specialist firearms officers, trained specifically for high-threat situations involving potential terrorism or weapon seizures, took positions that gave them clear sightlines to the incident while ensuring civilian safety. Commander Sarah Henderson arrived on scene in an unmarked vehicle, her years of experience immediately assessing the situation. She could see that while the immediate threat appeared to be three poorly planned individuals rather than organized terrorists, the weapons interference made it impossible to treat the incident lightly. Any attempt to disarm a guard had to be considered a potential precursor to more serious attacks. Danny Walsh was now visibly shaking as he maintained his grip on James Mitchell's rifle. The weight of the weapon, combined with the stress of the situation and the sound of approaching sirens, was making him realize the magnitude of his mistake. Sweat poured down his face as he looked around at the growing number of armed officers taking positions around him. Marcus Thompson's bravado was finally beginning to crack as he saw the serious firepower being deployed in response to their actions. Police snipers were visible on nearby rooftops, their weapons trained on the group. The reality that he might have just orchestrated something that could end with someone being shot was starting to penetrate his consciousness. James remained in perfect control, his years of training allowing him to stay calm even as chaos erupted around him. He could feel Danny's trembling through the rifle they both held, and he used his voice to try to de-escalate the situation, speaking in measured tones designed to calm rather than provoke. He knew that any sudden movement from either of them could trigger a response from the armed officers now surrounding them. Constable Williams had been joined by several other officers who formed a tight perimeter around the group. Their priority was to isolate the incident and prevent any escalation while giving the specialist time to arrive and take control. Williams continued to speak directly to Danny, explaining clearly what needed to happen for the situation to end peacefully. The crowd of tourists had been pushed back to a much wider perimeter as more police officers arrived to establish crowd control. Many people were still filming with their phones, though they were now doing so from behind police barriers rather than from close range. The footage being captured would later show the professional restraint demonstrated by the guards and police throughout the incident. Kevin Torres had managed to blend into the crowd of retreating tourists, but his relief was short-lived. Plainclothes officers had been tracking his movements since the incident began, and he was quietly apprehended as he tried to leave the area. His criminal record had made him easy to identify through facial recognition, and witnesses had clearly seen him as part of the group that initiated the confrontation. Inside the palace, senior officials were being briefed on the developing situation. The incident had triggered protocols that required notification of government security services, as any potential weapons seizure at royal properties was treated as a possible terrorist threat, until proven otherwise. Counterterrorism specialists were already analyzing the backgrounds of all three men to determine if they had any connections to extremist groups. Danny's grip on the rifle was becoming increasingly unsteady as his arms tired from holding the weapon. James could sense his fatigue and used this to his advantage, gradually adjusting his own position to maintain better control, while making it more difficult for Danny to do anything dangerous with the weapon. The guard's subtle movements were designed to tire Danny further, while positioning himself for a quick resolution if the opportunity arose. Marcus was now surrounded by officers from multiple directions, their presence making it clear that any attempt to help Danny or escalate the situation further would result in immediate arrest. His phone, which he had been using to record the incident for social media, had been confiscated by police as evidence. The reality that their prank was being treated as a serious crime was finally becoming undeniable. The sound of a police helicopter overhead added another layer of intensity to the scene. The aircraft carried additional surveillance equipment and tactical officers who could respond if the situation required intervention from above. Its presence also sent a clear message to any other potential troublemakers in the area that law enforcement was taking the incident very seriously. Negotiation specialists had arrived and were preparing to take over communications with Danny and Marcus. These officers were trained specifically in de-escalation techniques for situations involving weapons and potential violence. Their goal was to convince Danny to release the rifle voluntarily, rather than forcing a physical confrontation that could result in injury. James could hear the radio chatter of the officers around him coordinating their response. Code words and tactical terminology filled the air as various units reported their positions and readiness status. The guard understood that he was now at the center of a major law enforcement operation, but his training kept him focused on his immediate responsibility, maintaining control of his weapon and protecting the palace. The incident was being broadcast live on social media platforms as tourists and bystanders shared their footage online. News organizations were already picking up the story, with reporters rushing to the scene to cover what was being described as a major security incident at Buckingham Palace. The three men's attempt at internet fame was succeeding, but not in the way they had intended. Danny's resolve was weakening rapidly as the full weight of the situation pressed down on him. The armed officers, the helicopters, the sirens, and the crowd all combined to create an overwhelming sense of pressure that made him desperately want to escape. But with James maintaining professional control of the rifle and police surrounding him from all directions, his options were becoming increasingly limited. The negotiation team made their first direct contact with Danny, using calm, professional voices to explain exactly what needed to happen for the situation to end safely. They offered him clear, simple instructions that would allow him to comply with police demands while saving face and avoiding injury. The choice they presented was stark: release the weapon and cooperate, or face the consequences of continued resistance. As the fourth phase of this dramatic incident reached its climax, all parties involved understood that the next few moments would determine whether the situation ended peacefully or escalated to a level that could result in tragedy for everyone involved. The tension in the air was so thick it felt like everyone was holding their breath as the police negotiator, Inspector Rebecca Clark, approached the standoff with careful, measured steps. She had 15 years of experience talking people through crisis situations, and she could immediately see that Danny Walsh was scared out of his mind rather than genuinely dangerous. Her challenge was convincing him to make the right choice before fear drove him to make an even worse decision. Inspector Clark positioned herself where Danny could see her clearly while staying out of the line of fire from the various armed officers who now had the group surrounded. Her voice was calm and authoritative but not threatening as she began speaking directly to Danny, using his name to establish a personal connection and make him feel like an individual, rather than just a target. Danny's hands were shaking so badly, now that James Mitchell could feel the tremors through the rifle they both held. The guard used this to his advantage, maintaining steady pressure that prevented Danny from moving the weapon, while also providing a stabilizing influence that kept the situation from becoming even more dangerous. James's training had prepared him for exactly this type of scenario, though he had hoped never to face it in real life. Marcus Thompson was watching his friend's distress with growing horror, as he finally understood the full consequences of what they had started. The sight of Danny surrounded by armed police officers with snipers visible on rooftops and helicopters circling overhead made the reality of their situation impossible to ignore. His dreams of internet fame had become a nightmare that could end with someone being seriously hurt or killed. The negotiator continued speaking to Danny in measured tones, explaining that everyone wanted the situation to end safely, and that he had the power to make that happen by simply letting go of the rifle and stepping back. She made it clear that no one wanted to hurt him, but also that his continued interference with the guard's weapon was forcing them to treat him as a serious threat. Commander Henderson was coordinating the overall response from a mobile command unit that had been quickly established near the palace gates. She had direct communication with senior government officials who were monitoring the situation closely, as any incident involving weapons at royal properties required immediate attention from the highest levels of security services. Inside the palace, staff members had been quietly moved to secure areas as a precautionary measure. While the incident appeared to involve only 3 individuals with no apparent terrorist connections, protocols required treating any weapons-related incident as potentially part of a larger coordinated attack until proven otherwise. The Queen's protection detail had been reinforced, and additional security sweeps were being conducted throughout the complex. Danny's resolve was crumbling rapidly under the intense pressure of the situation. The weight of the rifle, the exhaustion from the adrenaline crash, and the overwhelming police response all combined to make him desperately want to escape. But Inspector Clark's calm voice was the only thing that seemed to offer him a way out of the nightmare he had created. James could sense Danny's weakening grip and prepared to regain full control of his weapon the moment the opportunity presented itself. His years of training had taught him to wait for exactly the right moment, rather than forcing a confrontation that might result in injury. He knew that patience and professionalism were his best weapons in this situation. The crowd of tourists and bystanders had been moved back to an even greater distance as more police officers arrived to establish security perimeters. The area around the palace gates now resembled a major crime scene, with police vehicles, ambulances, and emergency command units creating a formidable presence that sent a clear message about the seriousness of the situation. Marcus was now in handcuffs, having been arrested when he attempted to approach Danny, despite repeated police warnings to stay back. His arrest was captured on multiple phone cameras, and the footage was already spreading across social media platforms as people shared updates about the unfolding drama. His plans for viral fame were succeeding, but as a cautionary tale rather than the heroic prank he had envisioned. Kevin Torres was being questioned in a police van nearby, his criminal history making him a person of particular interest to investigators trying to determine if the incident was part of a larger plot. His cooperation with police was helping to establish that the 3 men were acting alone and had no connections to terrorist organizations, information that was crucial for determining the appropriate level of response. The negotiation process continued as Inspector Clark gradually built rapport with Danny, acknowledging his fear, while also making clear the consequences of continued resistance. She explained that releasing the rifle immediately would demonstrate his willingness to cooperate and could significantly impact how the courts would view his actions when the case eventually went to trial. Danny's breathing was becoming increasingly labored as the stress of the situation took its toll on his body. The adrenaline that had initially fueled his bravado was wearing off, leaving him exhausted and increasingly aware of how much trouble he was in. The realization that he could face serious terrorism charges was beginning to penetrate his consciousness. James maintained his professional demeanor throughout the extended standoff, but internally he was calculating various scenarios for regaining control of his weapon. His training had covered situations exactly like this one, and he knew that the longer the standoff continued, the more likely it was that someone would make a mistake that could lead to tragedy. The media presence around the palace was growing rapidly as news organizations dispatched reporters, and camera crews to cover the developing story. Helicopter news crews joined the police aircraft circling overhead, providing live aerial footage that was being broadcast around the world. The incident was becoming international news, with viewers watching the drama unfold in real time. Emergency medical teams had been positioned strategically around the scene, prepared to respond immediately if anyone was injured during the resolution of the standoff. Their presence served as both a safety measure and a sobering reminder of how serious the situation had become. Ambulances stood ready with their engines running. Crews prepared for multiple scenarios. As the standoff entered its most critical phase, everyone involved understood that the next few moments would determine whether Three Men's Foolish prank would end with arrests and embarrassment, or with tragedy that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. The choice was entirely up to Danny Walsh, who held both a rifle and the power to end the crisis peacefully in his trembling hands. Inspector Clark continued her patient work, gradually convincing Danny that his best option was to trust her guidance and end the standoff voluntarily, rather than forcing a resolution that might not end well for anyone involved. The moment of resolution came suddenly, as these situations often do. Danny Walsh, overwhelmed by exhaustion, fear, and the constant pressure of Inspector Clark's patient negotiation, finally made the decision that ended the standoff. His hands simply opened, releasing their grip on James Mitchell's rifle as his knees buckled and he collapsed to the ground in complete emotional and physical exhaustion. James immediately secured his weapon, stepping back with the fluid motion of someone whose training had prepared him for exactly this scenario. The guard's composure never wavered, even as Danny crumpled to the pavement sobbing with relief and terror. Within seconds, police officers moved in to take Danny into custody, their movements precise and professional, as they ensured he posed no further threat. The arrest was swift and efficient. Danny offered no resistance as officers placed him in handcuffs and began reading him his rights. His collapse had been complete, transforming him from a would-be internet prankster into a defeated young man who finally understood the magnitude of his mistakes. The contrast between his earlier bravado and his current state was stark and sobering for everyone watching. Inspector Clark maintained her position throughout the arrest, continuing to speak calmly to Danny to ensure he remained cooperative. Her voice provided a steady anchor of reassurance as officers processed him, helping to prevent any last-minute panic that might have complicated the situation further. Her experience showed in every aspect of how she handled the delicate transition from standoff to arrest. The crowd of onlookers erupted in a mixture of cheers and nervous laughter as the tension that had been building for hours finally broke. Tourists who had been trapped behind police barriers began taking photos again, though now they were documenting the aftermath of a serious incident rather than what they had initially thought was entertainment. The mood was relief mixed with disbelief at what they had witnessed. Commander Henderson coordinated the immediate aftermath from her mobile command post, ensuring that all 3 suspects were properly secured and that the scene was thoroughly documented for the investigation that would follow. Her teams began the methodical process of collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, and preparing the detailed reports that such a high-profile incident would require. James Mitchell finally relaxed his stance. Though he remained at his post as protocol demanded, his rifle was inspected immediately to ensure it had not been damaged or tampered with during the incident. The guard's professionalism throughout the ordeal would later be commended by his superiors, as he had maintained perfect composure and control even under extreme provocation. Marcus Thompson watched his friend's arrest from the back of a police van where he was being held, the reality of their situation finally hitting him with full force. His plans for viral internet fame had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, but not in any way he had intended. Videos of their failed prank were already spreading across social media platforms, but they showed 3 men being arrested rather than cleverly outwitting palace security. Kevin Torres had been providing a full statement to investigators, his cooperation aimed at minimizing his own legal exposure by demonstrating that he had tried to distance himself from the situation once it began escalating. His criminal history meant he faced the most serious potential consequences if charged as a repeat offender, making his cooperation essential for any hope of leniency. The emergency response began winding down as teams confirmed that the threat had been neutralized and no additional suspects were at large. Helicopter units returned to base, armed response vehicles departed for their normal patrols, and the extensive security perimeter was gradually reduced to allow normal tourist activities to resume around the palace. Medical personnel evaluated Danny at the scene before he was transported to a police station for formal processing. His collapse had been emotional rather than physical, but protocol required ensuring he was medically fit for detention and questioning. The stress of the incident had taken a visible toll on all three men, who looked exhausted and defeated as they were led away in separate police vehicles. The investigation that followed would be extensive and thorough. Anti-terrorism specialists would analyze every aspect of the incident to ensure there were no connections to larger threats, while regular criminal investigators would build the cases against all three men for their various charges. The evidence collection process included hundreds of hours of video footage from security cameras and tourist phones. Social media analysis revealed the extent to which the incident had been documented by bystanders. Videos taken from multiple angles provided investigators with a complete record of events, while also creating a viral phenomenon that spread far beyond what the three men had originally hoped to achieve. Their names became associated with one of the most dramatic security incidents in recent palace history. The charges against the three men were serious and varied. Danny faced the most severe potential penalties for his direct interference with James's weapon, including charges related to attempting to disarm military personnel and endangering public safety. Marcus was charged with conspiracy and inciting the incident, while Kevin faced charges as an accessory, despite his attempts to distance himself from the situation. News coverage of the incident was extensive, with analysts discussing the implications for palace security and the broader issues of social media-driven pranks that cross legal boundaries. The story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of seeking internet fame through increasingly extreme behavior, particularly when targeting high-security locations and personnel. James Mitchell's actions throughout the incident were widely praised by security professionals and military personnel. His ability to maintain composure while preventing escalation demonstrated the high level of training and professionalism expected of the Queen's Guard. The incident served as a reminder that these soldiers are far more than ceremonial figures in elaborate uniforms. The palace security review that followed the incident led to several procedural updates, though officials noted that existing protocols had worked effectively to contain and resolve the threat. The response demonstrated the sophistication of modern royal protection measures while also highlighting the dedication of the personnel responsible for maintaining security at these historic locations. The three men who had started their day planning a simple prank for social media attention found themselves facing serious criminal charges and the prospect of significant jail time. Their story became a viral sensation, but as an example of how quickly poor decisions can escalate into life-changing consequences rather than the harmless entertainment they had envisioned creating. The incident served as a stark reminder of the serious nature of royal security and the real consequences that await anyone who attempts to interfere with the dedicated professionals responsible for protecting these important institutions. 6 months after the incident that had transformed three would-be pranksters into cautionary tales, the legal proceedings finally reached their conclusion. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, security professionals, and members of the public who had followed the case since the dramatic footage first appeared on social media platforms around the world. Danny Walsh received the harshest sentence of the three, facing 18 months in prison for his role in attempting to disarm a Queen's Guard. The judge noted that while his actions appeared to stem from poor judgment rather than malicious intent, the seriousness of interfering with military personnel at a high-security location required significant consequences. His defense attorney's arguments about his client's lack of criminal history and genuine remorse helped prevent an even longer sentence. Marcus Thompson was sentenced to 12 months in prison, with 6 months suspended for his role in organizing and encouraging the incident. The court recognized him as the primary instigator whose influence had pushed his friends beyond mere harassment into actual criminal behavior. His social media posts planning the incident, which investigators had recovered from his phone, demonstrated premeditation that aggravated his culpability in the eyes of the law. Kevin Torres received the lightest sentence of the three, with 6 months in prison suspended for 2 years, along with community service requirements. His cooperation with investigators and his attempts to distance himself from the situation, once it began escalating, were viewed favorably by the court. However, his previous criminal record meant he would face serious consequences if he violated the terms of his suspended sentence. The incident had far-reaching consequences beyond the individual prosecutions. Palace security protocols were reviewed and updated, though officials emphasized that existing procedures had worked effectively to contain the threat. Additional training was provided to guards and police officers on handling social media-motivated incidents, as these had become increasingly common at tourist attractions worldwide. James Mitchell was formally commended for his professional conduct throughout the incident. His ability to maintain composure while preventing escalation had avoided what could have been a much more serious situation. The guard was promoted to corporal and assigned additional responsibilities training new recruits in crisis management techniques. His experience became part of the standard curriculum for Queen's Guard training programs. The viral nature of the incident had unexpected educational benefits. Security professionals around the world studied the footage to analyze response procedures and identify best practices for handling similar situations. The incident became a case study in military academies and police training programs, demonstrating both the importance of professional restraint and the serious consequences of poor decision-making. Social media platforms experienced a temporary surge in copycat incidents as other attention seekers tried to replicate the viral success of the palace confrontation. However, the serious legal consequences faced by Danny, Marcus, and Kevin served as a deterrent that helped reduce the frequency of such attempts. Their story became a cautionary tale shared widely in discussions about responsible social media use. The three men's lives were permanently changed by their brief moment of internet infamy. Danny struggled to find employment after his release from prison, as background checks consistently revealed his role in the palace incident. The viral nature of the story meant that potential employers could easily find detailed accounts of his actions with a simple internet search. Marcus faced similar challenges, but his role as the instigator made his situation even more difficult. The extensive media coverage had made him the face of irresponsible social media pranking, a reputation that followed him long after his sentence was completed. He eventually moved to another city and changed his career path entirely, hoping to escape the notoriety that had replaced his dreams of internet fame. Kevin's lighter sentence allowed him to avoid the worst consequences, but his association with the incident still impacted his life significantly. His cooperation with authorities and his obvious remorse helped him maintain some employment opportunities, though he remained forever linked to one of the most dramatic security incidents in recent palace history. The incident sparked broader discussions about the role of social media in encouraging increasingly dangerous behavior among young people seeking viral fame. Experts in psychology and social media analyzed the case as an example of how the pursuit of online attention could override common sense and lead to serious criminal behavior. Tourism around Buckingham Palace initially decreased in the immediate aftermath of the incident, as visitors became more aware of the serious security measures in place. However, interest eventually returned to normal levels, with many tourists specifically hoping to see the guards who had become famous for their professional handling of the crisis. The footage of the incident continued to circulate online years later, serving as a permanent reminder of the consequences of poor decision-making. Educational institutions used the videos to teach lessons about personal responsibility, the importance of thinking before acting, and the real-world consequences of seeking attention through inappropriate means. Inspector Rebecca Clark, the negotiator who had talked Danny into surrendering peacefully, was recognized for her skill in preventing what could have been a tragic outcome. Her techniques were studied and incorporated into training programs for crisis negotiation teams across the country. The incident demonstrated the critical importance of having properly trained professionals available to handle high-stress situations. The palace continued to attract millions of visitors each year, with the incident becoming part of its modern history, rather than a defining tragedy. The professional response of the guards and security personnel had reinforced public confidence in royal protection measures, while also serving as a reminder that these historical sites required appropriate respect from visitors. Years later, The three men would occasionally be recognized by people who remembered the viral videos of their arrest. For Danny, Marcus, and Kevin, what had started as a plan for harmless internet entertainment had become a permanent part of their life stories, a reminder that the pursuit of social media fame can have consequences that last far longer than any viral video. The incident ultimately served multiple purposes, demonstrating the professionalism of royal security forces, providing a cautionary tale about social media-driven poor decisions, and reinforcing the serious consequences that await anyone who attempts to interfere with the dedicated professionals responsible for protecting Britain's most important institutions. The story of their failed prank became a lasting lesson about the importance of thinking before acting and respecting the boundaries that protect both historical sites and the people responsible for their security.